No noble would defend Princess Illyra Veon when the black doors of the Star Tribunal opened. Not one jeweled lord, not one oath-bound cousin, not one knight whose family had eaten from her mother's table for 6 generations. They all stood beneath the 1,000 watching banners of the imperial court, with their eyes lowered and their hands folded safely over their perfumed sleeves. While the exile chains on Illyra's wrists rang louder than any bell in the hall, she had once entered that chamber to music, crowned in moon silver. Daughter of the old line, beloved by soldiers, feared by merchants, envied by cousins. But now she came barefoot on cold glass, her hair cut short by prison guards, her royal cloak replaced by gray exile cloth, her name stripped from the succession scrolls. And every noble who had sworn to protect her blood suddenly discovered something fascinating on the floor. Then the High Chancellor asked the ancient question: does any soul of standing raise hand, blade, or voice in defense of Illyra Veon, accused traitor, enemy sympathizer, and breaker of imperial command? Silence answered so completely that even the ceiling flames seemed ashamed to burn. Illyra had prepared herself for death. Because exiled princesses rarely survive tribunals arranged by the men who stole their thrones. But she had not prepared herself for cowardice to have so many familiar faces. Lord Pelvin, who had wept when she saved his son from pirates, kept his gaze on his rings. Lady Cirith, who had called Illyra the hope of the new court, lifted a lace fan to hide her mouth. Captain Rule, once her sparring master, stood behind the Chancellor with armor polished like obedience, refusing to meet her eyes. Even her cousin Prince Maelor, whose smile had always carried poison wrapped in silk, looked almost bored on the regent's throne, one gloved hand resting on the arm carved for Illyra's dead father. The nobles had already chosen, not truth, not law, not honor, but survival under Maelor's shadow, and all that remained was ceremony. A pretty execution with legal ribbons. Illyra remembered the charge clearly: treason. Because she had refused the order to abandon the frontier colony of Haven Reach Rebellion. Because she had redirected evacuation ships meant for noble estates toward burning worker domes, enemy sympathy. Because she had opened a medical corridor for wounded children. From both sides after the Korath raiders cracked the Moonshield, she had saved 200,000 civilians and ruined 3 noble fortunes in the process. Then her father died of a convenient fever. Maelor became regent. The rescued colonists were called witnesses of chaos. And Illyra became the stain that had to be cut from the royal cloth. They had offered her one escape: confess, renounce the crown, marry a loyal house, and spend her life smiling from a guarded villa. She refused, so they brought her to the Star Tribunal, where law still allowed one final defense. If anyone of standing raised a hand, no one did. That was when a chair scraped at the very back of the hall. At first the sound seemed small, almost rude. A broken note inside a funeral hymn. Heads turned. Guards shifted hands to spear grips. And from the last row reserved for foreign observers rose a human so old by court standards that several young lords nearly laughed from relief. He wore a dark veteran's coat, faded at the elbows, a plain Terran field pin at the collar, boots repaired more than once, and a silver brace around one knee that clicked when he stepped into the aisle. His hair was iron gray, his face lined by weather and wars. His left hand scarred across the knuckles, but his right hand rose steadily into the light. Not high, not theatrical, simply enough for the law to see it. The court stared as if a ghost had misunderstood the invitation. The Chancellor narrowed all 4 eyes and said, "Identify yourself, foreigner." The human's voice was rough, quiet and plain. Sergeant Thomas Hale, retired. Terran Expeditionary Relief Corps, citizen observer under the Haven Accords. The Chancellor's mouth twisted. "You are not noble." Sergeant Hale looked around at the frozen lords. "Then that is fortunate, Chancellor. Because nobility appears unavailable today, the words struck harder than any blade." A laugh almost escaped from some servant balcony and was strangled at birth. Maelor leaned forward, smile cooling. This tribunal requires a defender of standing, not a camp follower with a pension and a limp. Hale reached inside his coat slowly, every guard tensing, and withdrew a small old medal on a frayed blue ribbon. The medal looked dull beneath all that crystal grandeur, but the Imperial Herald gasped before he could stop himself. The Chancellor stiffened. Hale placed the medal on his palm. Terran Star of Sanctuary, awarded by Empress Vina II after the siege of Alir Gate. With attached rights of recognized standing before imperial courts, unless the court wishes to dishonor its own dead empress, the hall changed. Because Ancient Gratitude had just walked in wearing a patched coat, Mailer's smile vanished for one clean breath. Illyra looked at the medal, then at the man, and felt something worse than hope, because hope could be killed too. The weakest hand in the hall had become the only hand brave enough to rise. The Chancellor tried to bury the moment beneath procedure, declaring that standing did not mean competence, that an old medal did not make a foreign veteran suitable for royal defense. Hal listened with the patience of a man who had survived officers who loved long speeches, then said, "I request the rights attached to the medal be read aloud." The Chancellor refused. Hale looked toward the herald, not commanding, only waiting, and the poor herald, trapped between written law and living fear, opened the archive scroll by decree of Empress Vina II. Any bearer of the Star of Sanctuary may speak in imperial court as shield friend to the throne, may defend the accused under oath, may call witnesses across rank, and may not be silenced except by lawful verdict. The words rolled through the hall like doors unlocking in distant rooms. Hale nodded, "Thank you." Then he turned toward Illyra and bowed. "Princess, if you accept an old human's hand, I will stand with you." Illyra should have refused. Pride told her to refuse. Royal training told her a princess did not accept pity from a foreign relic when her own nobles would not meet her eyes. But Hale's hand was not pity. It was weathered, scarred, steady. A bridge built out of things that had already endured breaking. She remembered seeing humans at Haven Reach, not in triumph, but in smoke, carrying stretchers through ash storms, repairing pumps under shellfire, singing badly to keep children breathing inside shelters. They had not looked noble then either, only impossible to move from the place where help was needed. Illyra raised her chained wrists as far as the guards allowed and said, "I accept." The chain between her hands shivered. Hal saw it, and something in his eyes hardened. Not anger exactly, older than anger, cleaner. He turned to the Chancellor. "Remove her chains." The court rustled. The Chancellor sneered. "She is accused," Hale replied. "She is defended. And unless imperial law now fears a woman's wrists, remove them." Asterisk. No one moved. Then from the back of the guard line, one elderly marshal stepped forward, saluted the medal on Hale's palm with trembling fingers, and unlocked Illyra's chains. The sound of falling iron echoed across every noble throat. The tribunal resumed with a new shape, no longer an execution pretending to be law, but a battlefield where Mailer's side had lost the comfort of fighting the helpless. The prosecution began with theater. Hala, images of burning Haven Reach, altered ship manifests, recordings of Illyra ordering palace escorts to disobey command, casualty charts polished until they looked like accusations. Chancellor Vosen called her reckless, emotionally contaminated by frontier sentiment. He claimed her choices weakened imperial strategy, emboldened the Korath raiders, and endangered noble hostages held in the inner districts. As he spoke, Hale stood beside Illyra without interrupting, taking notes on paper, actual paper, which made young courtiers smirk until they realized every scratch of his pen came at moments they hoped no one noticed. When the Chancellor ended by declaring that a princess who valued common evacuation over command, hierarchy had broken the Empire's spine, Hall lifted his head and said, "May I ask questions now?" Asterisk. The Chancellor waved a jeweled hand, eager to show confidence. Hale walked toward the projection of the evacuation map, slow because of his brace. Each click of metal against glass, marking time like a patient clock. He pointed to the Noble Estate evacuation zone. "The prosecution claims Princess Illyra stole ships from here." "Correct, correct," Chancellor Vosen said. Hale nodded. "How many nobles were physically present in that zone when the evacuation order was issued?" The Chancellor blinked. That is irrelevant. Hale looked to the tribunal judges. Is the number secret? One judge frowned. Answer. Wasson checked a tablet, 62. Hale pointed at the manifest and ship capacity allocated to them. 12,400 seats. A murmur moved through the hall. Hale did not raise his voice. Why does 62 require 12,000 seats? Bosun snapped. Servants, guards, heirlooms, cultural assets. Hale turned to the nobles, cultural assets like crystal hunting sculptures, private wine vaults, and ceremonial fur. While Worker Dome 7 had 11,000 children under a cracked shield, a noble shouted. Those assets are hereditary treasures, Hale replied. Children are also hereditary, usually asterisk. The first crack in Mailer's perfect tribunal appeared as a servant laughed openly from the balcony. It was one laugh immediately silenced. But everyone heard it. Alira felt the air change at her back. Hale pressed no advantage with drama. He simply asked for the unedited distress logs. Wasson objected. Hela cited the Star of Sanctuary rights. A judge reluctantly ordered them displayed. The polished prosecution map vanished, replaced by raw messages from Haven Reach. Mothers reporting oxygen loss, miners begging for pumps. Korath civilians trapped in crossfire, Illyrian soldiers requesting permission to carry children instead of ammunition. Voices layered until the hall no longer smelled of perfume, but of panic remembered. Alira closed her eyes, hearing again the hour she made the decision that ruined her life. Hale did not protect the court from those voices. He let them speak until nobles shifted. Until some looked sick. Until Mailer finally snapped. Enough, the Chancellor said. The Regent requests order. Hale turned slowly. Order is what Princess Alira restored when command abandoned arithmetic. This was not a duel of swords, but the old human was drawing blood from lies. The prosecution called Lord Pelvin next, a noble with soft hands and a face trained for sorrow. He testified that Alira had been unstable after battle, that she ignored counsel, that she spoke of opening corridors for enemy wounded. He looked at her only once, then away. Hale approached him with kindness so visible that it became dangerous. Lord Pelvin, you received rescue priority at Haven Reach. Yes, because my son was wounded, and who carried your son from the collapse. Pelvin swallowed. Terran medics Hale nodded. And whose order placed those medics in the noble sector before the second blast? Pelvin's mouth tightened. I do not recall. Hale unfolded a paper note. You wrote Princess Illyra a private message afterward. Would you like me to refresh your memory? Pelvin paled. The judges demanded the note. Hull read only what law required, Your Highness. My son breathes because you disobeyed cowards. My house owes yours life beyond measure. He folded the paper. Are those your words, Lord Pelvin? The noble's eyes filled, not from courage, but from shame arriving too late. Yes, Hale asked. Did Princess Illyra act from madness when she saved your son? Pelvin whispered. No. Mailer's fingers dug into the throne. Lady Cirith came next, testifying that Alira's relief corridors had let Korath raiders escape. Hale asked how many Korath patients were registered through those corridors. She said she did not know. Hale knew. 86 wounded, including 14 children, 3 pregnant civilians, and 1 captured raider lieutenant who later provided shield codes that saved Imperial Battalion 9. Cirith argued that mercy was not strategy. Hale answered, mercy that returns intelligence, protects civilians, and prevents revenge killings is strategy with a longer memory. Captain Rule testified that Alira undermined military command. Hale asked him who ordered the third bridge sealed while refugees were still crossing. Rule said the order was classified. Hull produced the order, signed by Prince Mailer. Not to protect the bridge, but to preserve a private arms convoy carrying Regent loyalists away from danger. The hall erupted. Mailer rose, robes blazing black and blue, accusing Hale of forged evidence. Hale looked up at him and said, I brought witnesses, too. Then the southern doors opened, and the Empire saw the people it had tried to turn into statistics. They came in slowly, because many could not walk quickly. Miners with burn scars, children with breathing masks, Terran nurses, Illyrian engineers, Korath civilians, still marked by enemy language tattoos. Widows in ash veils, veterans with missing limbs, a whole procession of inconvenient survivors. The nobles recoiled as if the poor were contagious, but the banners above the tribunal watched without blinking. At their front walked a young girl with silver prosthetic legs, perhaps 12 years old, carrying a broken royal insignia pressed in both hands. Alira knew her, Miri from Worker Dome 7. The child who had asked whether princesses were allowed to be scared while the ceiling burned. Miri stopped before the judges and lifted the insignia. Princess Alira gave me this when the evacuation ship shook. She said she told me if anyone asked why I was on a noble craft, I should say because I was part of the Empire. The child turned toward the noble benches. My brother died because the first ships were full of furniture, but I lived because she threw furniture into space. No advocate could have written a sharper indictment. Hallie let the silence after it stretch until it hurt. Then he asked Miri, "Did Princess Alira ask your family for loyalty? Tribute? Political support? Anything in exchange?" Miri shook her head. She asked if I could breathe. The words moved through Alira like a hand squeezing her heart. She had not cried when they shaved her hair, not when they named her traitor, not when her cousins spat near her feet. But now she had to grip the table to remain royal. Hale saw and looked away, giving her privacy in the only form available. The witnesses continued, not perfect, not rehearsed, sometimes contradicting details because truth does not march like propaganda. But the shape was undeniable. Alira had broken orders, yes. But the orders had been rotten. She had diverted ships, yes. From empty privilege to living need, she had opened medical corridors, yes. And those corridors had prevented massacres, disease, and the collapse of prisoner exchanges. The tribunal that began as a blade slowly became a mirror, and many nobles did not enjoy their reflection. That evening, the judges recessed under pressure from Mailer, who needed time to repair fear. Alira was taken to a guarded side chamber. No chains now, but no freedom either. Hale entered with 2 cups of bitter court tea and a limp worse than before. She accepted the cup and said, "Why are you doing this?" Hale sat opposite her, lowering himself carefully. "Because I raised my hand? That is not an answer. It is the only one that matters today." She studied him. "You knew my grandmother." He looked at the medal in his palm. "I knew her before she was empress. When she was a field commander with mud in her boots and terrible coffee in her flask, she saved my unit at a Lear gate. We were relief soldiers. Not supposed to be in the line, but lines move when artillery argues. Your grandmother held the gate open for evacuation and told us that an empire is not measured by palaces, but by who gets carried when the road breaks." Hale looked toward the tribunal wall. "I heard that same sentence in the Haven logs from your mouth. So I came." Alira's voice softened, despite herself. "You came alone." Hale smiled faintly. "At my age, princess, one is how most things begin." Then the smile faded. "No, not alone. Never alone. Humans carry the dead in crowded rooms. We carry everyone who once pulled us from fire. That metal is not jewelry, it is a debt with metal edges. Your house once raised a hand for me. I am returning the gesture." Alira looked at his scarred fingers wrapped around the cup. "The court will punish you if Mailer wins. Probably, you may die here." "Everyone may die somewhere," Princess Hale said. "But dying because cowards disliked being named is at least tidy." She laughed before she could stop herself. A small, broken sound in a room built for despair. Hale's eyes warmed. "There she is." She stiffened. "Who?" "The woman the witnesses followed through fire. Not the exile they dressed for execution." Before Alira could answer, alarm shook the palace. Asterisk, the strike did not come from outside. It came from beneath the tribunal itself. Where old maintenance tunnels connected the archive vaults to the royal crypt, Mailer's agents had chosen the recess to do what the law was failing to accomplish. Kill the witnesses, burn the evidence, blame Korath infiltrators, and declare emergency rule before dawn. The first explosion tore through the hall of lesser scrolls. Fire climbing the walls in blue sheets. Hale was on his feet faster than his brace suggested, pushing Illyra behind a stone column as the chamber doors burst open and smoke rolled in. Guards shouted conflicting orders, some loyal, some bought, and from the corridor came the unmistakable rhythm of military boots moving with murder's confidence. Illyra reached for the fallen spear of a guard. Hale caught her wrist. "Not that way," she snapped. "We are under attack," he answered. "Yes, and every attacker expects a princess with a spear. None expects old architecture." He kicked aside a rug, found a service hatch by touch, and opened it with a tool hidden in his boot heel. They descended into darkness while the palace burned above them. Hale moving first, despite his knee, Illyra following, gown torn, lungs filling with dust behind them. 3 witnesses, Miri, a Terran nurse named Asha, and Lord Pelvin of all people, stumbled into the passage before Hale sealed it. Pelvin was bleeding from the temple and sobbing apologies. Hal ignored the apologies and put him to work carrying Miri, which was probably the kindest punishment available. The tunnel smelled of old stone and forgotten water. Emergency lights dead, tremors traveling through the walls. Hale navigated by memory he should not have had. Illyra asked how he knew the path. He said, "Empress Vena's engineers gave Terran relief teams the palace evacuation map after Illyr Gate, in case nobility ever forgot civilians again." Illyra almost laughed at the cruelty of history. Maelor's palace had been mapped by the gratitude of the grandmother he betrayed. Asterisk. Behind them, the hatch screamed under cutting torches. Hale stopped at a junction, listened, then pointed left. Asha whispered, "That leads away from the witness quarters." Hale nodded. "Correct. But the survivors are that way, yes. And so are the killers who know you care." Illyra stared at him. "We cannot abandon them." Hale looked at her then, hard enough to hurt. Defending people is not running toward the first scream. It is making sure the second scream has somewhere to run. He handed her a palm-sized Terran beacon. "Take them to the cistern chapel, open the lower gates. Ring the flood bell 3 times, she understood. The flood bell would trigger ancient evacuation routes across the servant quarters. Hale was sending her to save hundreds. While he went toward the killers, she said, "You are barely walking." Hale tightened the brace on his knee. "Then I will not waste steps." The old veteran vanished into smoke, and Illyra realized the raised hand had only been the beginning. Hale did not fight like the palace duelists, who believed battle required witnesses. He fought like a man cleaning a wound. Quietly, thoroughly, with regret, but no hesitation. He never drew a sword because he had not carried one. He used tunnel doors, steam valves, light breakers, fire foam, collapsing shelves, warning sirens, and the attacker's own hurry against them. The first squad chasing the witnesses found the corridor flooded knee-deep because Hale opened the cistern drains. Their heavy armor shorted at the joints, and before they could recover, evacuation workers, guided by his beacon, sealed them behind a pressure gate. The second squad reached the archive vault and found every evidence crate already tagged with Terran microtransmitters, pulsing copies into orbit. The third squad cornered Hale near the old crypt stair, or thought they did, until he asked their commander whether Maelor had promised land grants or debt forgiveness. The commander hesitated for half a breath, enough for Hale to throw a lantern into powder dust and blind the whole squad white. Illyra reached the cistern chapel and rang the flood bell. 3 brutal notes rolling through the bones of the palace. Servants knew the sound even if nobles had forgotten it. Doors opened, hidden stairs unfolded. Kitchen crews began moving witnesses through laundry tunnels. Stable boys carried archive boxes. Gardeners hauled wounded courtiers onto grain sleds. And suddenly the palace's invisible people became its true defense. Illyra stood among them, giving orders with smoke on her face and no crown on her head. The exile cloth that had marked her shame became a signal in the darkness. People followed it because it was the only royal color that had come down from the dais into the burning lower halls. When loyal guards found her, they did not ask whether the regent approved. They saluted the woman saving the witnesses. Captain Rule arrived with 20 soldiers. Face pale, shame finally stronger than fear. "Princess," he said, "I await command." Illyra looked at him for one heartbeat. then handed him Miri Protector first. Earn the rest later. Above Mailer made his final mistake. He entered the tribunal hall before the fires were fully contained, wearing emergency armor, flanked by loyalist troops, and declared that Korath assassins had murdered key witnesses and that Illyra had fled custody. The noble benches filled with frightened lords willing to believe anything that kept them breathing. Chancellor Vossen prepared the emergency decree, and the judges sat trapped beneath armed eyes. Miller raised his voice to the banners. Citizens of the Empire. Tonight treason revealed its foreign roots. The human agitator and the exiled princess conspired with enemy survivors to destroy our sacred court. For the safety of the realm, I assume full sovereign authority. He reached for the seal, smiling again because cowards often mistake temporary silence for victory. Then the tribunal screens came alive with Hale's face, bruised, dusty, and extremely irritated. He was standing somewhere in the archive tunnels beside a live evidence crate, one hand pressed to a bleeding cut over his eyebrow. The transmission flickered through Terran relays beyond Mailer's control. Hale said, "I apologize for interrupting the Regent's lie before it matured." Several nobles made strangled sounds. Mailer screamed for technicians, but every screen kept showing the old human. Hall continued, under Shieldfriend writes, "I submit attempted witness murder, archive arson, misuse of loyalist troops, and unlawful emergency seizure to the judges. Evidence has been copied to Earth, having reached the Sapphire Fleet, and because I am old and suspicious, every servant bell network in the palace." At that cue, the bells rang, not alarms this time, but voices. Recorded orders from mailers, commanders, payment logs from noble accounts, tunnel maps marked with assassination routes, and one private message in Mailer's own voice, saying, "Let the children witnesses burn first." Sympathies harder to cross-examine. The hall changed from frightened to dangerous. Nobles who had bowed to Malar began stepping away from him. Not from virtue, from survival changing sides. Captain Rule entered through the southern doors with loyal guards. Illyra beside him, Miri on a stretcher behind her, but alive. Witnesses emerging in lines through servant passages. The princess walked through smoke and ash into the tribunal she had been dragged through hours before. No chains, no crown, no permission. Hale's image remained on the screens above her. She looked at Mailer, and the court finally saw the difference between bloodline and royalty. Mailer grabbed Chancellor Voson's arm. "Order them back." The Chancellor looked at the judges. The guards, the screens, the servants, the child alive behind Illyra, and discovered that cowardice had a limited shelf life. He stepped away. "Prince Mailer, you appear accused." That was the moment every noble learned why humans did not need titles to defend a throne. Mailer did not surrender. People like him rarely did, while a final cruelty remained. He seized a ceremonial plasma blade from a guard and dragged Lady Cirith before him, pressing the blade to her throat, a fitting hostage, perhaps, because she had lied for him and now looked horrified that loyalty had not protected her. "Back away," Mailer shouted. "I am regent by blood. I am the state." Illyra stopped 10 paces from him. Hale's voice came through the speakers. "Princess, do not rush." Mailer snarled at the screen, "You old animal. Come face me without tunnels and tricks." Hale's image shifted as he moved, and then he appeared through the western archive door in person. Limping badly, coat scorched, one arm hanging stiff, but walking. He had come back into the hall because defense sometimes meant standing where the frightened could see you. He stopped beside Illyra, breathing hard, and Mailer laughed. There, the noble savior, the foreign grandfather. "Can you even lift a weapon?" Hale looked at Lady Cirith, then at Mailer's blade angle, then at the judges. "I do not need to." He spoke to the guard nearest Mailer, Ensign Var. "Your mother's debt was purchased by the regent yesterday. Your sister is in the North Medical School." He promised both. If you kept quiet, the guard flinched. Hal pointed to another, Lieutenant Sen. "Your unit was told the witnesses were already dead. They are not. Look at them, one by one." Mailer's protective wall became individual people again, each named, each seen. each pulled out of the anonymous machinery of obedience. Elira realized Hale had spent the entire day not merely gathering evidence, but memorizing the human shape inside every uniform. Mailer pressed the blade harder, drawing a line of blue heat near Cirith's skin. "Enough," he screamed. "You think names stop power," Hale said. "No, but they remind power it is outnumbered." Then he looked at Lady Cirith. "My lady, when I move fall," she sobbed. "I cannot." "Yes, you can," Hallie replied. "You have disappointed everyone today. Startle us." Mailer's eyes flicked in disbelief, just once, and that was enough. Hall dropped his cane, not toward Mailer, but onto the polished glass floor. Where its metal tip struck the fallen exile chains Elira had worn earlier, the chains skidded, ringing under Mailer's boots. Instinct pulled his gaze downward. Cirith collapsed. Elira stepped in, not with a killing stroke, but with both hands catching the weapon wrist the way Hale had shown in the tunnel. Captain Rule slammed Mailer from the side. Guards piled on. The plasma blade died. And the regent who had built a throne from fear ended face down on the same glass where Elira's chains had fallen. The hall did not cheer. Not at first, because shame stood too close to relief. Hale retrieved his cane with difficulty, then bent to pick up Elira's old chains. He held them out to the judge's evidence, he said, and fainted immediately afterward. Asterisk. When Hale awoke, he was in the royal infirmary, which annoyed him because he considered infirmaries places for people with time to be ill. Elira sat beside the bed in a plain chair. No crown, no jewelry. Tribunal stood still in the cuticles of her hands. He opened one eye and said, "Did we win?" She answered, "You fainted with excellent timing. That is not a verdict." The judges suspended Mailer's authority, arrested Vossen's loyalists, and restored my name pending final succession review. "So," Hale murmured, "untidy victory." She leaned back. "It gets worse. The witnesses refuse to leave until they see you. The servants have started calling you Old Hand, and Lady Cirith sent flowers with a note that says you are the rudest savior in history." Hale closed his eye. "Terrible woman. Hope she recovers." Elira smiled. Then the smile faded into something more fragile. "Why did you return to the hall?" "You had already sent the evidence." "You could have escaped." Hale was quiet, the machines beside him blinking softly. Finally he said, "A raised hand is only useful if people can still see it." The final tribunal convened 7 days later, not in secret, not under Mailer's guard, but in the open plaza below the Star Tribunal, where commoners could hear the law spoken without velvet walls muting its uglier parts. Hale arrived in a wheeled chair, pushed by Miri. Because he refused noble assistance and Miri refused his refusal, Elira stood before the judges. Not as a prisoner now, but not yet restored. She listened as every charge was read again. Treason, insubordination, misuse of royal ships, enemy sympathy. Then the judges read the findings. No treason. Because no lawful order may require needless civilian death, justified insubordination. Because command had been corrupted by private interest, proper use of royal ships. Because imperial vessels serve imperial lives before imperial property, no enemy sympathy. Because medical mercy under crisis preserved strategic intelligence, prevented retaliatory slaughter, and upheld the old accords signed by Elira's own ancestors. Each sentence landed like stone placed in a foundation. Not glamorous, but enduring. Then came the succession question. Mailer's conspiracy had exposed the noble houses too deeply for a simple restoration. Some judges wanted Regency Council. Others wanted delay. Several nobles, now brave after danger past, argued that Elira's compassion made her beloved but politically risky. Hale requested permission to speak one final time. The chief judge granted it with visible caution. Hale rose from the wheeled chair, despite Miri scolding him in a whisper sharp enough for front rows to hear. He leaned on his cane, looked at the noble benches, then at the crowd of workers, soldiers, servants, survivors, and children. "I am not a citizen of your empire," he said, "and that means you are free to ignore me with dignity. But I have seen a pattern across many worlds. When courts ask whether a ruler is strong enough, they often mean cruel enough, rich enough, obedient enough to the fears of powerful men. They ask who can punish, who can threaten, who can make enemies kneel. Those questions are not useless, but they are incomplete. He turned toward Illyra. A ruler is also measured by who they refuse to spend. Princess Illyra refused to spend children for furniture, prisoners for hatred, witnesses for convenience, servants for secrecy, and law for speed. Her enemies call that weakness because their strength requires other people to vanish quietly. But I have seen weak rulers. I have seen them hide behind flags while villages burn. I have seen them call retreat dishonor from rooms with private exits. I have seen them confuse applause with courage and blood with proof. Illyrivian stood in fire and counted lives when everyone else counted advantage. That is not softness, that is command. The plaza was silent. Hale's voice roughened. As for nobility, today your nobles did not raise their hands. A child did, a nurse did, servants did, miners did, old soldiers did. Perhaps your empire should ask itself where its noble blood went, and whether it might be found again in those who defend without being invited. No one breathed for a moment, then Miri raised her small hand from behind the chair. Not because law required it now, but because symbols are sometimes wiser than judges. Across the plaza, workers raised hands, soldiers raised hands. Servants raised hands still scarred from carrying archive crates through smoke. One by one, hundreds, then thousands, until the plaza became a field of lifted palms. Illyra looked at them and understood the throne differently than she had before. Not a seat above people, but an answer to hands raised below. The chief judge removed his ceremonial mask and bowed his head. By authority of the Star Tribunal, Illyra Vian is restored as princess, sovereign, and lawful heir of the Sapphire Throne pending coronation at moonrise. The crowd did not explode into joy. It rose like weather. First breath, then voice, then thunder. The coronation at moonrise was not the one Illyra had imagined as a child. There were no golden beasts, no procession of perfectly loyal houses, no orchestra trained to flatter bloodlines. Half the noble benches were empty because their owners were incels. Exile, or sudden spiritual retreats. The palace still smelled faintly of smoke. The great banners had scorch marks. The crown had to be repaired where Mailer's men had cracked its side during the coup. Yet when Illyra walked toward the throne, she felt less alone than she ever had under perfect ceremony. Miri carried the repaired royal insignia on a cushion. Captain Rule walked behind her without his command plume. Earning trust one step at a time, servants stood openly in places where only nobles once stood. And Hale waited beside the dais in his worn coat, refusing a metal sash because, as he said, one troublesome ornament was enough. Before the crown descended, Illyra turned to the court. "I was exiled because I chose lives without permission," she said. "I was abandoned because fear made cowards of those trained to call themselves brave. I was defended by a man who owed me nothing except an old debt to what this empire once was. If I take this crown, I take it with a law. Never again will standing belong only to blood from this night. Any citizen who has saved imperial lives under oath may raise hand in defense before the tribunal. Any servant may witness against a lord without losing bread. Any soldier may refuse an unlawful order that spends civilians for convenience. And any child of the empire, noble or not, will be counted before property gasps moved through old houses. Hope moved through everyone else." Illyra looked at Hale. "And the Star of Sanctuary will no longer be an old medal buried in archives. It will be a living order, granted not for conquest, but for carrying others when the road breaks." The crown touched her head, cracked, repaired, imperfect, honest. And the hall knelt, not all from love, some from shock. Some from calculation, some because power had changed shape, and they needed to survive it. Hale did not kneel, and no one asked him to. He simply raised his hand again, palm outward. The same plain gesture that had begun the impossible turn of law. Illyra raised her own hand in answer. Queen, too, veteran, thrown to witness, saved to defender. And in that quiet exchange, The court understood more than ceremony could say. Years later, when children studied the tribunal of the raised hand, their tutors tried to explain the legal reforms, the fall of Mailer, the Haven evidence, the servant bell network, the witness protections, the opening of standing rights, all the important things that built the new empire from the ashes of the old. But children preferred the simpler version, the one told in markets and guardhouses and relief ships. They said no noble would defend the exiled princess. Because nobles had polished their courage until it reflected only themselves, they said the court had gone silent. The chains had rung, the judges had looked away. And a human veteran with a bad knee and a worse sense of caution had raised his hand. They said he fought without a sword, wounded lies instead of bodies, made servants into shields, witnesses into thunder, and cowards into evidence. They said the princess became queen because one old soldier remembered that honor is not a title. It is a movement of the hand when everyone else keeps theirs safely folded. In later years, Hale sat beside Queen Elira in the restored tribunal hall, now open to public petition 3 days each week. His hair had gone nearly white, and Miri, grown tall on silver legs, served as junior advocate with a talent for terrifying corrupt landlords. A case had just ended, a kitchen worker defending a stable boy against a minor lord, and the worker had won badly, beautifully. Hale watched the lord escort it out, then murmured, "Your nobles are improving." Illyra laughed. "Some of them are now useful." "Do not become sentimental. I am queen. Sentiment is allowed when properly weaponized." Hale gave her the tired side-eye that had become famous in 3 sectors. Illyra said, "Do you ever regret raising your hand?" Hale did not answer quickly. Humans rarely did when the truth deserved space. Finally, he said, "I regret needing to." She nodded. "That is not the same." "No," he said, "it is not." Below them, another petitioner stepped forward, a young soldier shaking with fear, prepared to testify against his commander for abandoning civilians during a storm. The judges asked the ancient question in its new form. Does any soul raise hand, blade, or voice in defense of the vulnerable? Before Illyra could move, hands rose across the hall. Servants, advocates, veterans, clerks, citizens, even to nobles, hesitant but real. Hale watched them, and the old grief in his face softened into something like rest. The Empire had finally learned what one human veteran had known when the whole court stayed silent. That civilization does not fall when enemies attack its walls. It falls when good people keep their hands folded. And it rises again the moment one tired soul lifts a hand and says, "I will stand here."